The FujiFilm GFX 50R might just be my favourite camera of all time, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about my thoughts on using it for the past year. But first off, let's talk about who this camera is for and who it is not for, because if it's not for you, there's no point you watching this entire video. To simplify it into one sentence, this camera is for photographers who don't mind working slowly, that want exceptional image quality and the medium format look at an affordable price. And who is it not for? Well, I would say sports photographers, photographers that want to take photos of fast moving subjects, photographers that want to shoot 100 photos in 3 seconds. This camera is just not capable of doing that kind of thing. But if you don't mind working slowly, this camera might just be the one for you. It isn't going to replace something like a Sony A7, a Canon R5 or a Nikon Z8, but it is something that is going to give you amazing, unique looking photographs, a lot like a medium format film camera. Let's start by talking about the first thing that you'll notice when you take it out of the box, and that is the ergonomics of the camera. I really love the rangefinder style, and Fuji have done a really good job at keeping the camera quite light, so not having a huge grip, in theory, wouldn't be that much of an issue. However, most lenses for the GFX system, especially manual lenses like this Mitakon 65mm, they're quite heavy and it makes the camera very front heavy, and then you just can't really get a good grip on the camera at all. I did talk about this in my first impressions video, and a few people commented on that and recommended getting a grip for the camera. So I actually went with the small rig wooden grip, and honestly this has improved the ergonomics of the camera by like 100 times. It genuinely feels really solid in my hand. It feels kind of like holding an old Canon DSLR, like a 5D or something like that. And having this wooden grip specifically on the GFX comes with other benefits that I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the video. Next thing we do is turn the camera on, and the user interface is basically the same as any other Fujifilm camera. A lot of people online seem to not like how Fujifilm lay out their menus, but if you're used to using something like the X100V or I don't know, the XT1, 2, 3, any Fujifilm camera in the past like 10 years, this menu system is going to feel really familiar. Everything is in the same place. So for me personally, this was a huge positive. It also means that if I'm shooting it alongside my X100 or anything like that, I don't kind of get confused between two menu systems. If I need to change settings on the fly, everything's in a really familiar place. I think for most people, the main selling point about this camera is going to be the image quality, and it really does not disappoint. The colours straight from this camera are absolutely beautiful. They are on all Fujifilm cameras, but this is truly no exception. And the 14-bit RAW files that come out of this camera are incredibly flexible. I would say that the RAW files from my A7 IV are slightly more flexible and you can get more out of them. But it is a much newer camera. I think the A7 IV came out in 2021 or 2022, and this camera came out in 2017, so for a camera that's 5 years older, it holds up really well. In my first impressions video, I did criticize the dynamic range of this camera, but honestly, I think that I was just shooting with it wrong. I was shooting on the DR100 setting, which I didn't realize at that time affected the RAW files. And I was also not protecting my highlights, which with this camera is really important to do, more so than on modern cameras, again like my A7 IV. If you keep the DR setting on DR400 and you protect your highlights while you're shooting, so basically just don't overexpose and blow out your highlights, the dynamic range from this camera is fantastic, and it really is so easy to get a really beautiful high dynamic range filmic look from the camera. One thing that I've really noticed about this camera is that when I take someone's photo and I show them it on the back of the screen like I always do, everyone's reaction is always so positive. Everybody always comments on how beautiful the colours are. Just the look of the files that this camera gives you, like it really does give you that, what people call the medium format look, especially if you're using a lens like this Mitakon the 65 1.4, you really do get that shallow depth of field, but with the wide field of view, like medium format look. There's just something like so magic about the files that come out of this camera. It really does just feel really special. In terms of editing the actual files, I shoot uncompressed RAW, and I just find the files so flexible. You can basically change the colors to whatever you want, and there's very little like banding or weirdness. You know, when it comes to like pushing the saturation of the colors, or if you shift in, you know, the blues to like more of a purple. In terms of like shadow recovery and stuff like that on the RAW files, it's really, really good. With it being a 50 megapixel sensor, you might be wondering what it's like in low light. And I would say that the low light performance is good. Like if you're pushing 6400 ISO, the files are grainy, but the one thing that is really interesting about this camera is because the sensor is so big, the grain is really, really small. So even if you're shooting at, I don't know, 12,800, if you look at the file on like a phone screen or something like that, the grain is so small that you can't even see it anyway. You'd only really see it if you blew the file up massive. So I don't know, in terms of low light, it's difficult because like modern cameras are definitely better in low light, but modern cameras have larger grain, which is easier to see. Whereas on this, it's like I said, it's really small, it's really fine, and it retains a lot of the detail. Images stay sharp and stuff like that. So I don't think that low light has ever really been an issue when I've been shooting with this camera. The battery life is surprisingly good. I expected it to be awful, just with it, you know, running such a big sensor, but I think that it's as good as any modern full frame camera. One thing to note is that I don't use autofocus because the lenses that I use are manual focus. I don't know if autofocus would make a huge difference to the battery life, but I could take one battery on a shoot and I very rarely need to switch to a second battery. But one thing that is worth mentioning about the batteries is that unfortunately Fujifilm do not make the batteries for this camera anymore. So if you wanted spare batteries, you'd have to buy a second-hand Fujifilm GFX battery, or you could buy a third-party one. There are a lot of companies that are making third-party batteries if you're not bothered about that. But yeah, I just think it's worth mentioning, and it's a little bit of a shame that Fujifilm decided to discontinue these. Going back really quickly to autofocus, like I said, I don't use it on this camera, I use manual lenses, but apparently the autofocus on the 50R just isn't that good. On the newer GFX cameras like the 100, I think the 102 or the 100S, whichever one's the new one, apparently the autofocus is really, really good to much improved, but on the 50R, apparently it's just not very good at all. Next, let's talk about file management, because you might be wondering what the files are actually like from this 50 megapixel sensor. When it comes to shooting RAW, you have two options. They are uncompressed and what is called lossless compressed. I personally shoot uncompressed. I have found that lossless compressed isn't actually lossless. If you're recovering a lot of detail from the shadows, mainly in extreme situations, but sometimes just, you know, you've underexposed too much and you want to recover some shadow detail, lossless compressed doesn't actually recover as much as uncompressed. It's not a huge difference, but I just think that if I'm going to be using a camera with such a high quality sensor, I might as well get the absolute best image quality from that camera. Uncompressed RAW files are around about 120 megabytes per image, and compressed RAW are around about 60 to 70. JPEG is smaller than that, but personally I don't really see why you would shoot JPEG on this camera. It does have the film simulations built in, and you can put recipes in and stuff like that, but personally for me, if I'm going to be shooting anything with this camera, I want to have complete control over my images, so I personally don't shoot JPEG. Now you might be thinking that 120 megabytes is an absolute insane amount per photo. However, I've realised that if I go on a shoot with this camera versus if I'm on a shoot with one of my other mirrorless cameras that's full frame, that only shoots kind of files that are half that size, the folder of images that I get in the end from the full frame camera is actually way bigger than the folder of images I get from this camera. And that is because this camera slows you down so much that you don't actually shoot as many photos as you would think. If I'm shooting on my Sony A7, I'll just snap away and take as many photos as I need to, whereas on this camera, especially because I'm manual focusing and I'm doing everything a lot more slowly, for each shot, I'll maybe only get 2 or 3 takes, whereas with my Sony camera, I'll get maybe like 20 different shots of the same image. So as it works out, you'll probably take up less hard drive space using this camera versus a full frame. I guess the only downside to the files being so large is that if you are editing on an older computer, the computer might be a bit slow and laggy when editing the files just because they are so big. A really interesting thing that I've noticed about this camera is people's reactions to it. And I've spoke about this on the channel before when I've been talking about the X100V, the fact that it's a rangefinder camera, it's small, it looks like a film camera. People don't find it threatening the way that they do with a bigger SLR looking camera, especially one with, you know, like a traditionally massive sort of zoom lens or anything like that. Now I find this really interesting about this camera because this camera is actually quite big. In fact, it is bigger than most SLR cameras, but I think the fact that it's still a rangefinder style, and especially with this wooden grip on, I feel like it still looks like a film camera. If I ask someone for a portrait with it, I often tell them that the camera is quite old and it's quite slow, which is true, but I think that also adds to the impression that the camera that you're using isn't just your average mirrorless kind of run-of-the-mill camera. It is a camera which is quite special and unique, and I think that in the same way that people like having their photo taken on film, people just react really well to it, and they feel like it's more of a special experience getting photographed with it. The camera looks special, and when I've taken people's photos with it, the photos look special too. So all in all, I think that it's just a really nice experience photographing people on this camera. Something that I feel like gets overlooked in a lot of YouTube reviews is the ecosystem around the camera. And with the GFX system, I don't think it's that great, and I do think it's a weak point of the camera. I mean, I've spoken in this video about the Mitakon lenses. They have a 65mm, they have an 80mm 1.6, which I reviewed in my previous video if you want to go and check that out. The 65mm I think is amazing. I honestly think it's a beautiful, beautiful lens. But in terms of wider lenses especially, there's just not that much choice for the GFX system, especially third-party lenses. You do have the FujiFilm GF lenses, there's quite a lot of them and they are great, but they do have limitations. A lot of them are quite slow and pretty much all of them are very, very expensive. Putting money aside as well, the GF lenses are also what is called focus by wire, which means that when you turn the manual focus ring on the lenses, it's not actually doing anything in the lens. What it's doing is sending a signal to the camera, and then the camera is what is moving the focus mechanism in the lens. This is pretty standard practice for modern mirrorless cameras, but unfortunately it ends up in a pretty miserable manual focusing experience. You can actually use adapted full frame lenses. I've used the Minolta 45mm f2, which I got recently, which is this lens here. I've used the Helios 4.4, that works great too. There's quite a lot of full frame lenses that you can use on the system, but a lot of them have really strong vignettes or softness in the corners. I mean, if you think about it, these lenses weren't made to be used on a medium format sensor. They were just made to be used on full frame cameras, so we can't expect them all to work. It's really cool that some of them do, but again, a lot of these come with limitations, and the really good ones that work really well are still quite expensive. There is someone who has took the time to do a really great compatibility chart on a lot of vintage lenses. I'm going to link that in the description below because I think that that's a really good resource if you plan on getting this camera and you do want to use some vintage glass on the camera. You can also adapt vintage medium format lenses, which will give you a much higher quality image than if you are adapting full frame ones, but a lot of these are quite slow, whereas a lot of the full frame ones, some of them have quite fast apertures. It just depends on what your priorities are, whether you want some fast glass or whether you want the absolute best image quality. After using this camera for a year, there's actually only one thing that irritates me about it. The maximum shutter speed is 1/4000, which doesn't sound that slow at all, but to get the best dynamic range out of this camera, you have to use the DR400 option, and to do that, you have to set your ISO to at least 400. Combine this with a moderately fast aperture like f1.4 or f2 or even f2.8, 1/4000 just isn't fast enough for a sunny day. It just lets too much light into the camera. Now there are two ways that we can combat this. First off, using the ND filter like an ND16 filter. This is definitely the best method. But what happens if you're out on a shoot and you don't have an ND filter? The only other option is to use the electronic shutter, which I think goes up to something like 1/16,000th of a second. The only problem with the electronic shutter is that it has genuinely what I think is the worst rolling shutter I have ever seen on a camera in my life. You can literally set your shutter speed to 1/16,000th and then you press the shutter button on the camera and you hold still and you wait 2 seconds, and then you can move once you feel like the photo's been taken, and you can look at the photo and it will look like this. Like I said, if you have an ND filter, this is not an issue, but if not and you don't have a tripod or anything like that, you are going to run into some problems with rolling shutter. It really is very, very bad. Overall, I absolutely love the GFX 50R. If it suits your style of working, there really is no better, more affordable camera on the market at the moment, and it's an amazing entry point for anyone wanting to get into medium format photography. Currently in the UK on MPB, these go for around about £2,000, which is actually cheaper than what you can buy a second-hand X100 Mark VI for. Sure, it's not without limitations. If you are wanting something for fast-paced work, or you're wanting something to replace a workhorse camera like an A7 IV, a Canon R5, a Nikon Z8, this is not the camera for you, but in my 15 years of shooting, I've never come across something that takes photos quite as magic as this. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this, please drop a comment below and let me know. It really, really helps the channel, and I will see you in the next one.